Hello everyone. Welcome back to Easy English Spark channel. I'm excited to have you here today. We're diving into an inspiring story about personal growth, embracing change, and stepping into a new beginning. Through this journey, we'll explore how storytelling in English can help you improve your listening, speaking skills, and confidence. Let's get started and light up your English learning journey. Chapter 1. A Routine Night. It was another one of those nights, ordinary, uneventful, or so I thought. January had settled in with its usual chill, a cold that made the air feel heavy, almost biting. The evening sky was dark, the kind of dark that made the streetlights seem faint, as though they were struggling against the night. I stood in front of the house, my fingers fumbling with the keys, locking the door behind me. The house was quiet, too quiet as usual. I wasn't sure why, but tonight something felt different, even though everything looked exactly the same. The front yard was neat, the driveway empty except for my car. The house was new, a modern design with smooth, clean lines. It was supposed to be perfect, wasn't it? A comfortable home in a quiet neighborhood. What more could I want? But that night, as I stood there locking up, a thought crept into my mind. Was this all there was to life? I took a deep breath, shaking off the doubt, and turned to head toward my car. Liam, my boyfriend, was sitting on the couch inside, staring at the TV. He didn't even glance up as I called out to him. "Bye, Liam," I said, hoping for some acknowledgement, any sign of affection. Nothing. He didn't respond. The only sound was the hum of the television. Maybe I was being dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Liam didn't look up. He didn't even say goodbye. "Tom, you know I don't like you working nights," he said, his voice carrying from the living room, barely loud enough to reach me. He said this every time. It was his way of showing concern, or maybe just a way to remind me that I didn't have to work these shifts. But I liked the money. I liked the independence it gave me. And honestly, I didn't want to deal with the conversation anymore. So I just nodded, even though I knew he couldn't see me. "I'll be back later," I called out as I grabbed my bag and stepped out into the cold. The kiss he gave me was brief, too brief. It didn't feel like the kind of kiss someone gives when they love you. It felt cold, detached, almost like an obligation. I stood there for a moment looking at him, trying to figure out why it felt that way. But before I could dwell on it too much, I turned and walked out the door. I started the car and pulled away, the engine purring softly beneath me. But my mind was miles away. I had the same thoughts I always did when I left the house at night. The thoughts that popped up uninvited, but stayed stubbornly at the front of my mind. Was I happy? Was this the life I really wanted? Liam had everything. He was older, tall with blonde hair, and those piercing blue eyes. He had a good job and liked to spoil me with things, expensive things, clothes, shoes, watches, jewelry. For my 18th birthday, he gave me a gold watch. It was beautiful, shiny, and elegant, just like everything else in my life. but it never felt like enough. I met him when I was still in school. Back then, I had dreams. Big dreams. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to tell stories that made people feel something. I wanted to make a difference. But Liam, he laughed when I told him about it. Writers are intelligent. You're beautiful, but you're not intelligent, he said. And somehow I believed him. I convinced myself that being beautiful was enough, that being loved by Liam was enough. So I moved in with him after finishing school. I didn't think about the rest of my life. I didn't think about what I really wanted. I thought I was in love. And that was supposed to be enough. But tonight, as I drove down the dark streets, I couldn't help but question everything. I reached the part of the city where I worked. The streets were quieter here, darker. I drove past the old buildings, the small shops, and the occasional person huddled against the cold. I thought about Liam again, about his words, about everything that had happened. I felt the cold kiss he had given me still lingering on my cheek, as if it was a reminder of everything I hadn't wanted to see. I parked the car outside the building and sat for a moment, staring at the entrance. It wasn't a glamorous job. It wasn't anything special, but it paid. I had my uniform, and when I put it on, I felt like I was part of something important. A sense of purpose, maybe. Or maybe I was just convincing myself. I thought about Liam's words again. I don't like you working nights. But I liked working nights. It was a simple job, nothing too difficult, and the hours were always the same. But the money, it gave me freedom. It gave me something that I never had before. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to rely on Liam for everything. I was earning my own money, doing something for myself. I thought about this as I walked toward the gates of the facility. This wasn't just a job. It was the first time I could feel like I was in control of my life, and it scared me a little. But it was also exciting. It was the first time I didn't need Liam for everything. It was the first time I was standing on my own 2 feet. And that night, as I walked into that building, I had no idea how much everything would change. It was just another routine night. But it wasn't. I didn't know it yet. But that was the moment everything would shift for me. Chapter 2. Life Behind Bars. The morning came and went in a blur of cold, dull light. By the time I arrived at the facility, the air had grown even colder, and the streets outside looked like they were covered in a thin layer of frost. It was as if the world outside had stopped moving, and everything was frozen in place, much like the feeling I had every time I entered that building. The security gates loomed ahead of me as I pulled into the lot. I rolled down my window and showed my identity card to the guards, who scanned it with practiced indifference. After a quick nod, they opened the first set of gates, and I drove through, my tires crunching over the gravel. Once inside, I stopped my car and walked toward the second set of gates. The guards here were more alert, more watchful. They weren't just checking to make sure I belonged. They were checking for everything, anyone, trying to spot a potential problem. Another identity card scan, another nod, another set of heavy metal doors opening. revealing the cold, gray expanse of the facility where I worked. This was my world, now. The Asylum Seeker Center, a place where people came to seek refuge in the UK, hoping for a better life, a chance to escape the horrors they had left behind in their home countries. When I first started working here, I didn't know much about the asylum seekers. I had a vague understanding, but I hadn't really thought about their lives beyond the rules I was required to enforce. I hadn't thought about why they were here, what had brought them here, or what they were going through. Now, after months of working here, I understood a little more, though I still didn't know everything. The walls of the facility were cold, the concrete floors echoing with every footstep. The dining area was large, with rows of tables and chairs that were almost always full. The air in here was thick with frustration, fear, and longing. It wasn't a place anyone wanted to be, yet it was the only place they could go. The asylum seekers, these men, women, and children, were all waiting to hear if they would be allowed to stay or if they would be sent back to the countries they had fled. Some of them had been here for weeks, some for months, and in some cases, years. The waiting was the hardest part, the uncertainty, the not knowing what the future held. They had come here looking for safety, but all they had was time, endless, painful time spent waiting. I walked into the dining room, where the familiar faces of the asylum seekers were scattered around the tables. Some of them looked tired, others were exhausted beyond words. Some looked angry, some scared, but most of them looked numb. They had seen too much, experienced too much. It was hard to blame them. I walked around the room, making sure everything was in order, checking for any trouble. Hated this job sometimes, hated the rules I had to enforce, hated that I was part of a system that kept people locked up while they waited for a decision. But it was my job. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't rewarding. But it paid the bills, and it kept me moving forward. Or at least that's what I told myself. As I walked past the tables, I tried to make eye contact with some of the people. Some of them looked up at me, but most just kept their heads down, their gazes empty. It wasn't that they didn't want to make eye contact. They were just too tired, too beaten down by the life they had left behind and the life they were now living. A woman sitting at one of the tables caught my attention. She was holding a small child, and they both looked exhausted. The child was clinging to her mother's side, his face pale and drawn. "Would you like some tea or coffee?" I asked the woman, offering a small smile, hoping to show some kindness. She looked up at me, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were tired, lifeless. I didn't know if she understood me, if she knew what I was offering, or if she even cared. I tried again, speaking slowly. "Tea? Coffee?" Just as I was about to turn away, I heard a loud shout from across the room. It startled me, and I looked up to see one of the other guards, Mark, shouting at a tall man who was standing near the table. "Put it back," Mark was shouting. "I saw you. You were stealing." The man, who had dark hair and a serious expression, looked down at his hands. I could see 2 biscuits in his grip, one in each hand. "Stealing?" the man said, his voice low but firm. "It's just biscuits." I could feel the tension in the air as the man stood his ground. He wasn't afraid of Mark's words. In fact, he seemed almost confused by the accusation. "I'm just giving one to my son," the man said, nodding toward the small child sitting at the table. Mark didn't seem to care. "You can only take one biscuit," he said, his voice cold. "The rules are the rules." I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room turning toward the scene. People were waiting, watching, waiting for something to happen. They were too tired to speak up, but their eyes told me everything. The man stood there, his face hardening. The woman, still holding the child, looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The man took a deep breath, then walked over to the child and placed both biscuits on the table in front of him. The child hesitated, his small hands trembling, unsure whether he should take the biscuits or whether it was against the rules. I watched as the man looked at the child, then turned to me. He gave me a small smile, a smile that seemed to hold more than just kindness. It was a smile of understanding, of solidarity, but it was brief. The child grabbed the biscuits quickly and ate them, one after the other. His mother didn't stop. She just let him eat, too tired to stop him. I watched them for a moment longer, my heart sinking. I wanted to say something, to step in and make the situation right, but I couldn't. My uniform made me the enemy. It made me the one who upheld the rules. The man's eyes met mine for a brief second, but then he turned away, his smile gone. The truth hit me then. I wasn't just a guard in a uniform. I wasn't just someone here to keep order. I wasn't just here to make sure the rules were followed. I was part of a system that kept people trapped, kept them waiting, kept them powerless. I wanted to make them feel better, to help them in some way, but I couldn't. I couldn't break the rules even if I disagreed with them. As I walked away from the table, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't know what was happening to me, but I knew that night something inside me had begun to shift, and it was only just the beginning. Chapter 3. A Changing Heart. The shift ended at 8 in the morning. The night had dragged on longer than I had expected, but that wasn't unusual. It felt like time moved differently in the facility, slower, heavier, almost as if the air itself was thick with the weight of all the waiting, all the uncertainty. By the time I clocked out, I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. But it wasn't just the work. It was everything. The conversations, the faces, the stories I didn't know, the ones I couldn't stop thinking about. I made my way to the supermarket to pick up some fruit. I needed something fresh, something colorful to fill the emptiness that was starting to gnaw at me. The fluorescent lights above flickered in the aisles, casting a harsh light over everything. But there was something comforting in the colors of the fruit. Bright reds, greens, yellows. Apples, bananas, oranges. They felt like a reminder of something simpler, something real. As I filled my basket, I tried to push away the thoughts of what I had seen the night before. The man, David, and his quiet act of kindness. It stuck with me, more than I wanted to admit. I paid for my groceries and walked back to the car. The cold air hit me like a wall as I stepped outside, but it didn't feel as harsh as it had earlier. Maybe it was the thought of the fruit in my bag, or maybe it was the fact that I was leaving the center for the day, but the world suddenly seemed more alive, more colorful. As I drove home, my mind wandered back to David. His face, his eyes, the way he smiled at his son when he handed him the biscuits. That smile, there was so much in it. Kindness, pain, hope, and something else that I couldn't put into words. I found myself wondering about him, wondering about his story. What had brought him here? What had he seen? What had he lived through? I hadn't thought much about the asylum seekers before I started working there. They were just faces in a crowd, just people who needed to follow the rules. But now, after months of seeing them day after day, I was starting to understand. I was starting to see the people, not just the labels. They weren't just asylum seekers. They were fathers, mothers, children. They were survivors. They were me. I parked in the driveway, the engine of the car humming as it cooled. I grabbed my bags and headed inside, but something was off. The house felt empty. More than it usually did. Liam's car wasn't in the driveway, and when I stepped inside, there was no sign of him. I knew he worked during the day, but the silence felt deafening. I walked through the rooms, the echo of my footsteps louder than usual. It was as if the walls were pressing in on me. I looked around at the things we had. The expensive clothes, the shoes, the jewelry, the television that sat too big in the living room. None of it mattered. None of it made me feel whole. None of it made me feel like I was living my life. I felt like I was living in a carefully curated version of reality, a version that Liam had created, one that I had allowed him to create for me. I walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the gold watch that Liam had given me for my 18th birthday. It was beautiful. It was expensive. But it didn't mean anything to me anymore. I remembered the day he had given it to me, the way his eyes had lit up as if it was the greatest gift he could give. But now, it just felt like another thing. Another piece of the life I had built around me, but not the life I wanted. I placed the watch on the bedside table and stood up. I went to the living room, turned on the television, but the sound didn't fill the silence. It only made it louder. I picked up the remote and flicked through the channels, but nothing caught my attention. My thoughts kept drifting back to David and his quiet strength. I thought about his words, about how he spoke of the past, of the things he had seen. I wanted to know more. I wanted to understand more. I didn't just want to be a spectator in my own life. I wanted to be part of something bigger. I wanted to make a difference. I grabbed my phone and sat on the couch, scrolling through the contacts. I stopped when I saw Liam's name. I paused, staring at it. I thought about calling him, but I didn't want to hear the same old complaints, the same old routine. I didn't want to hear about how he didn't like me working nights or how he thought I was, wasting my time. I didn't want to hear about how much better things would be if I just stayed home, if I just let him take care of everything. But I knew it wasn't that simple. I knew that what was happening inside me couldn't be ignored. I couldn't pretend anymore. I couldn't ignore the fact that something had shifted inside me, that I was beginning to see the world differently. It wasn't just about David. It wasn't even just about the work I was doing at the center. It was about me, about who I was becoming. I wasn't the person I used to be. I wasn't just the girlfriend who waited for Liam to come home, who lived for the material things he gave me. I wasn't the person who needed him to validate my worth. I was someone else now. I was someone who could think for herself, who could make her own choices, and who could shape her own future. And that thought terrified me, because it meant I had to change. It meant I had to face the truth about my life and my relationship with Liam. It meant I had to let go of the life I had built, even if it was comfortable, even if it seemed perfect. I couldn't live in that world anymore. The truth was clear, now. I couldn't pretend. I couldn't ignore what was happening inside me. And as much as it scared me, I knew that the only way forward was to embrace that change, to embrace the person I was becoming. So I picked up the phone, my fingers trembling slightly. I didn't call Liam. I didn't know what I would say to him anymore. Instead, I typed out a message, short and to the point. I'm not sure where we're going anymore, Liam. I need to figure things out. I can't keep pretending. I pressed send, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I felt ready to face it. And I knew, deep down, that everything was about to change. Chapter 4. Discontent. It was Friday night, the first real night off I had in weeks. I had been looking forward to it all week. The idea of spending some time with my best friend, Isla, at her house. She was hosting a dinner party, something small and intimate, with just a few close friends, and I needed to get away from the constant weight of work and home life. The invitation had come at the right time, but deep down, I knew I wasn't going to escape the growing discontent that had been brewing inside me for some time now. I stood in front of the mirror, carefully choosing my outfit. I had decided to wear a red dress, something simple but elegant. It made me feel good, made me feel like I was still part of the life I used to have, the one where I was more than just a girlfriend or a worker. I had always prided myself on having a sense of style, a way of standing out, and tonight was no different. I paired the dress with my favorite heels, the ones Liam had bought for me last month. They were expensive, of course. Everything he bought me was. When I walked out into the living room, Liam was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV. I could see his eyes light up for a moment when he looked at me, but it was different this time. There was no genuine warmth in his gaze, just a quiet acknowledgement. "Wow," he said, his voice flat. "You look beautiful." He didn't get up. He didn't even move from the couch. His eyes wandered back to the TV screen almost immediately, as though I wasn't even there anymore. I stood there for a moment, wondering if I was imagining things, but I knew I wasn't. This was how it had been for a while now. like we were two strangers living in the same house. There was no excitement, no spark, no connection. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound casual, as I grabbed my purse from the table and walked toward the door. "I'll be back later." "You're going to that dinner party with Isla, right?" he called after me, still not looking up. "Yes," I replied, my voice tight. "I'll be fine." "You don't have to worry about me." "I'm not worried," he said, his tone dismissive. "Just be careful. You know I don't like you going out late." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. His voice had lost the caring tone it used to have. It was as though he had resigned himself to something, to the fact that I was just a fixture in his life, someone who existed without really being there. We had stopped talking, stopped connecting, and I hated the way it made me feel. I walked out of the house and headed to my car, the door closing behind me with a soft thud. The drive to Isla's house was longer than usual, and the street seemed emptier. I found myself staring out the window, lost in thought, as the world moved by in a blur of streetlights and darkened buildings. Everything felt detached, like I was living in a world that wasn't mine. The city had always been a place of possibility, of life. But tonight it felt empty, as though everything had lost its meaning. When I arrived at Ila's house, I was greeted by the sound of laughter and music coming from inside. Isla was standing in the doorway, a glass of wine in hand, wearing a warm smile. "Finally," she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug. "You're here. You look gorgeous, as always." I smiled, trying to hide the turmoil inside me. "Thanks, Isla. I needed this. I really did." She looked at me with a knowing expression, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I can tell. You've been looking a little lost lately. Are you okay?" I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm fine. Just, life, work, everything." She didn't press further, but her expression said it all. She knew something was wrong. We had been friends for years, and she knew me better than anyone. But tonight, I wasn't ready to talk about it. I wasn't ready to admit that everything in my life felt like it was slowly unraveling. The evening passed in a blur of food, wine, and small talk. Isla's boyfriend, James, was there, along with a few other friends from work and the neighborhood. The conversation was light, the kind of conversation you'd expect at a dinner party. But it felt shallow, forced. The laughter, the jokes, the easy chatter, it all seemed so far removed from what I was feeling inside. Every time I tried to engage, I felt like I was pretending. I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. At one point, Isla pulled me aside while everyone was in the kitchen, getting more food and refilling drinks. She gave me a concerned look, one that made my heart skip a beat. "What's going on, really?" she asked, her voice softer now. "You've been so distant lately, I can see it. You're not yourself, Sophie, and I know it's not just work." I could feel the lump forming in my throat. Isla was the one person who always saw through the walls I built around myself. She knew I was good at hiding my feelings, but she knew when something was wrong. "I don't know what's happening," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm just lost. It's Liam. He's changed. And I've changed too. I don't even recognize myself sometimes. Isla's face softened, her expression turning from concern to understanding. Sophie, you've been with him for so long. Maybe you're just growing apart. It happens. Sometimes people change, and the relationship doesn't. You've been living in his shadow for so long. Maybe it's time for you to find out who you really are outside of all of this. I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words sink in. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had been living in Liam's world for too long, in the life he had created for both of us. And now, I was starting to realize that it wasn't the life I wanted. It wasn't the life I had dreamed of. The thought of leaving Liam, of walking away from everything I knew, terrified me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that staying wasn't an option either. Staying meant continuing to live a life of quiet discontent, a life where I wasn't truly myself, where I wasn't free to pursue my own dreams, my own happiness. I don't know if I can leave him, I said quietly, almost to myself. But I can't keep living like this. I feel like I'm suffocating. Isla took my hand, squeezing it gently. You don't have to do it all at once, Sophie. Just take it one step at a time. But you need to figure out who you are, what you want, and what you deserve. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to live your life the way you want to. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting to see things clearly. It wasn't just about Liam. It wasn't just about work. It was about me. I had to start living for myself. I had to start making my own choices, even if they were scary. As the night wore on, I found myself withdrawn, lost in my thoughts. The laughter and conversation around me felt like it belonged to someone else. I smiled, nodded, and pretended to join in, but inside, I was somewhere else, somewhere deeper. I was thinking about my life, about what came next, about the changes I had to make. By the time I left Isla's house, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't go on like this anymore. Something had to change. I had to change, and I wasn't sure where that would take me, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. Chapter 5. Discovering the Truth. The days blurred together after Isla's party. The small talk and pleasantries, the pretend smiles, the way I went through the motions of my life. Everything felt like I was acting in a play I hadn't auditioned. 4. I had gone back to the routine, back to the same house, the same job, and the same conversations with Liam. But something had shifted in me, something I couldn't ignore anymore. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay. I couldn't pretend that I was happy in a life that was slowly suffocating me. It was during one of those long, exhausting shifts at the Asylum Seeker Center that I first realized how much I had been avoiding the truth. I had gotten so used to seeing the faces of the people who were waiting, so used to the monotony of my job, that I had stopped truly listening to them, to their stories, to their pain. But tonight was different. The air felt heavier, the room quieter than usual. It was as if the weight of everything had finally caught up to me. As I walked through the dining hall, I noticed the familiar faces of the asylum seekers. Some were sitting with their heads down, others looked up as I passed, their eyes filled with longing, with fear, with uncertainty. But there was one face that stood out more than the rest. It was David, the man who had given the biscuits to the little boy weeks ago. He was sitting at a table, his face hard, his expression unreadable, as usual. I felt a strange pull in my chest, an ache, a desire to know more, to understand him. It wasn't just the way he had smiled at me that night. It wasn't just the kindness he had shown to that child. It was the way he carried himself, as though he had seen and experienced things that I could never imagine, things that made him who he was. The more I thought about him, the more I wanted to understand. I walked over to his table, hesitating for a moment before I spoke. "David," I said softly. He looked up at me, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to decide whether to acknowledge me. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. "Can I sit?" I asked, gesturing toward the empty chair next to him. He nodded, and I took a seat. We sat in silence for a few moments, the hum of conversation and clinking of cups in the background. "I see you here every night," I said, trying to break the tension. I want to understand. I want to know your story." David's eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe, or maybe just curiosity. It was hard to tell. He had become so good at hiding his emotions, so practiced at keeping everyone at arm's length. "You want to know my story?" he asked, his voice quiet, but with a certain edge. "Why? You think it'll make you feel better? Or maybe you just think you're doing your job by making me talk?" I paused, unsure of how to respond. His words stung, but I understood them. I had spent so much time just going through the motions, following the rules, keeping people at a distance. But something had shifted inside me, something I couldn't ignore. And David was part of that. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice soft. "Maybe it's just because I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of not knowing the truth. I want to understand what it's like, really, to be in your shoes." David leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching mine, almost as though he was weighing me, trying to figure out if I was being sincere. After a long moment, he sighed. "All right, I'll tell you. But don't think it's going to make you feel any better. Don't think it'll fix anything." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. This was what I had been waiting for, whether I was ready or not. David took a deep breath, and for the first time, he started to speak. "I'm from Syria," he began, his voice quiet, but with an undeniable strength behind it. "I was a photojournalist. I wanted to show the world the truth. I wanted to show what was really happening in my country, the violence, the fighting, the destruction. But the government didn't like that. They didn't want the world to see what they were doing to their own people." His eyes darkened, his expression hardening as he spoke. I could feel the weight of his words, the truth of his pain. And it was more than I had expected. I had heard of the atrocities in Syria, of course, but hearing it from him, hearing it in his voice, made it real, made it personal. They came for me, he continued. The police. They came to my house, to my office. They destroyed everything. My equipment, my photos. They took me. They locked me up for days. They beat me. They tortured me. All because I was showing the truth. I felt a lump form in my throat as he spoke, my heart breaking for him. But David wasn't finished. He wasn't done telling me everything he had been through. They told me I was a traitor, he said, his voice barely a whisper now. That I was betraying my country, betraying my people. They told me I deserved to die for what I had done, and maybe they were right. Maybe I should have kept quiet. Maybe I should have just walked away, but I couldn't. I couldn't turn my back on the truth. His words hung in the air between us, thick and heavy. I could see the scars on his arms, the physical evidence of what he had endured. But there was something else, something deeper. There were emotional scars that couldn't be seen, that wouldn't heal so easily. He had been through hell, and he had survived. But survival didn't mean he was free. I had to leave, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I couldn't stay. They would have killed me. So I fled. I came here to England, hoping for safety, hoping for a new life. But when I got here, they brought me here, to this place. Another prison, just a different name. Another place where I have to wait, where I have no control over my future. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known about the asylum seekers. I had known about their struggles, but I had never truly understood until now. I had never understood the cost of their survival, the weight of the decisions they had to make. And I realized, in that moment, how little I had truly understood my own life. I had been living in a bubble, a comfortable bubble, where everything was predictable, where everything was easy. But David's truth shattered that bubble. It showed me how little I knew, how much I had taken for granted. I'm sorry. I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know. I didn't understand. David looked at me then, his eyes softening for just a moment. You couldn't know. You couldn't understand until you walked in my shoes, but now you do. I sat there for a long time, not knowing what to say, not knowing how to respond. The weight of his words, the weight of his truth, was more than I could carry on my own. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back to the way I had been living. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. Not after hearing David's story. I wasn't just a guard in a uniform anymore. I wasn't just a bystander to their lives. I was part of their world now. I couldn't just stand there and follow orders anymore. I had to make a choice. And I knew, deep down, that the choice I made from here on out would change everything. Chapter 6. Breaking the Rules. The days after my conversation with David were unsettling. Every moment seemed to be weighed down by the knowledge of what I had heard. His story lingered in my mind, replaying over and over again, each detail more haunting than the last. The things he had gone through, the price he had paid for telling the truth, for trying to show the world what was really happening in his country. It all felt so unfair, so wrong. But what was worse was how little I had known before. I had spent so much time focusing on my own life, my own small, comfortable world, that I had never really taken the time to understand the lives of those around me, the lives of people like David. The next few shifts at the Asylum Seeker Center felt different. The air in the facility seemed heavier somehow. The faces of the asylum seekers seemed sadder. The walls seemed to close in a little tighter. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was part of something that wasn't right, that I was complicit in keeping them trapped, in keeping them waiting. The rules were clear, but they didn't feel right anymore, and I didn't know what to do about it. As I walked through the halls of the facility, I saw the usual faces, some tired, some angry, some resigned. But now, every face seemed to be carrying a deeper sadness, a deeper sense of hopelessness. It was hard not to feel the weight of it all, to not be affected by the way they looked at me. I had always thought of myself as just a guard, just someone doing their job. But now, I wasn't so sure. I wasn't so sure that just following orders was enough anymore. I walked into the dining hall, my eyes scanning the room. The tables were filled with people, just as they always were. Some were eating, others talking in hushed voices, while a few just stared at their plates, lost in thought. I passed a few familiar faces, nodding politely as I made my way to the back of the room. That's when I saw him, David. He was sitting at a corner table, his eyes distant, his posture stiff. He hadn't seen me yet, and I took a moment to just watch him, to observe the way he carried himself, the way he sat there, almost like he was trying to be invisible. I felt a pull in my chest, the same pull that had been growing inside me ever since we had talked. Without thinking, I walked over to his table. As I approached, he looked up and our eyes met. There was no surprise in his gaze, just a quiet acknowledgement, as though he had expected me. "David?" I said softly, my voice just above a whisper. "Can we talk?" He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. I sat down, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this wasn't allowed. I knew I was breaking the rules by sitting with him, by engaging with him like this. But something inside me felt like it was worth the risk. "What's on your mind?" David asked, his voice low and careful. I wanted to know how you're doing, I said, not sure if that was even the right thing to say. "I wanted to check in, after everything you told me." David's expression softened, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't anger or suspicion, it was vulnerability. The kind of vulnerability that comes from being seen, really seen, by someone. "I'm surviving," he said simply, his hands resting on the table, his fingers tapping softly. "But surviving isn't the same as living, you know?" I nodded, the weight of his words settling on me. I had seen so many people go through the motions of survival, but I had never really understood what it meant to truly live. I had taken my own life for granted, never questioning it, never wondering what it meant to be truly free. "You've told me your story," I said, my voice shaky. But I want to know more. What do you want? What do you need to be able to live, not just survive? David looked at me for a long time, his eyes searching mine. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. I want to be free, he said, the words heavy with meaning. I want to tell my story. I want to show people the truth. But I can't do that here. I can't do that if they send me back. I want to go home. I want to see my family again, but I don't even know if they're still alive. All I have is this place, these walls, these rules. His words hit me like a wave, crashing over me. I had never really understood the true cost of freedom, of the right to live without fear, without restrictions. I had never truly understood what it meant to be trapped, to be forced to wait, to be held in limbo while the world around you moved forward. I don't know how to help you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I want to. I want to do something. I can't just sit here and watch you all wait for decisions that might never come. David's gaze softened. I know you want to help, Sophie. I can see it in your eyes. But there's not much you can do. Not within the rules. I felt a pang of guilt in my chest, a deep, aching guilt. The rules that had kept us all trapped here, that had kept me from doing anything, that had kept me from truly connecting with these people. The rules that had kept me silent, that had kept me obedient. I'm tired of the rules, I said, my voice trembling. I'm tired of doing what I'm told without ever questioning why. I don't know what I can do, but I know I can't keep pretending that this is okay. David looked at me, his eyes intense, almost as if he were seeing something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. You have the power to make a difference, Sophie, but it won't be easy. The moment you start questioning the system, the moment you start breaking the rules, things will change, and you can't take that back. I sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I knew he was right. If I broke the rules, if I started doing things differently, everything would change. But what if that was the change I needed? What if I could make a difference? I'm ready, I said finally, my voice steady now. I'm ready to stop just following orders. I'm ready to do something, anything to help. David gave me a small, knowing smile. Then it starts with you. The rest will follow. I stood up from the table, feeling a strange sense of clarity wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I knew what I had to do. I didn't know how it would work, or what the consequences would be. But I knew that the path I had been walking was no longer enough. It wasn't enough to just follow the rules, to just do my job. It wasn't enough to stand by and watch others suffer. As I walked away from the table, my heart was pounding with uncertainty, with fear, but also with something else. Hope. For the first time, I felt like I was truly awake, truly alive. And I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Breaking the rules was just the beginning. Chapter 7. The Letter. The days that followed the conversation with David felt like an emotional roller coaster. Every shift at the center was filled with a quiet tension, the air thick with unsaid words and emotions that I hadn't fully processed. I had started breaking the rules in small ways, talking to the asylum seekers, listening to their stories, looking past my uniform and seeing them as people, not just cases. It was dangerous, I knew. I knew I could lose my job if anyone found out what I was doing, but I couldn't help myself. I had become too invested in their lives, in their struggles, in their hopes for a future that seemed so uncertain. And then, one morning, as I was preparing for another shift, I found something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a letter, placed on the table in the break room, addressed to me. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. The envelope was plain, the handwriting on it neat and careful. My name was written in the corner, but there was no return address. My heart began to race, a mix of excitement and apprehension building within me. I wasn't sure why, but I had a feeling I knew who it was from. I glanced around quickly, but there was no one else in the room. I walked over to the table, my hands trembling slightly, and picked up the envelope. I turned it over, wondering who had left it for me. As I held it in my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that this letter was important, that it was something that could change everything. Without thinking twice, I tore the envelope open. The paper inside was thin and rough, the kind of paper you'd expect from someone who didn't have much. I unfolded it carefully, and there, written in clear, simple handwriting, were the words that made my breath catch in my throat. Dear Sophie, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to write to you because I can't stop thinking about our last conversation. You gave me hope. Hope that I hadn't had in a long time. I didn't expect anyone here to listen, not really. But you did. And for that, I am truly grateful. I'm still here, in the center. It's hard to explain, but every day feels like I'm trapped in a never-ending waiting room, with no answers, no direction. The lawyers are still processing my case, but I don't know if it will work out. I don't know if I'll ever leave this place. But I wanted to tell you something. After we talked, I began to think about what I really want out of all this. I want to do more than just survive. I want to live. I want to find a way to contribute to this world, to make it a better place for my son, for my people. But right now, I am stuck. I am stuck in a system that doesn't care, and I don't know how long I can keep going like this. Sophie, I am not asking for anything from you. I don't want charity, but I need you to know that you have made a difference in my life. You've reminded me that there are still good people in the world. People who see us for who we are, not just the label we've been given. Please take care of yourself. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that I am stronger now because of you. Yours truly, David. I stood there, the letter in my hands, my heart racing. I could feel the weight of his words, the emotion. Behind them, the raw honesty that had poured from him. It was strange reading this letter because I had expected something much more formal, something detached. But this wasn't a letter from a stranger. It was a letter from someone who had shared a piece of his soul with me. I felt a knot form in my throat as I read his words again. I had made a difference in his life. I had made a difference just by listening to him, just by being there. It was humbling, overwhelming. I hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the connection to go so deep. But there it was, undeniable and real. I couldn't help but wonder about the future, about what would come next. David had been waiting for so long, and I had seen the toll it had taken on him. But more than that, I realized something else. I had been waiting too. I had been waiting for something to change, for something to wake me up. And now, I was awake. The letter had confirmed what I already knew deep down. I couldn't stay in this life of quiet compliance any longer. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. David had shown me that there was more to life than just surviving. There was living, there was fighting for something better, and there was taking action. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my bag. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew it was important. It was a reminder of why I had to keep going, why I had to keep pushing for change, not just for David, but for everyone trapped in the system. I couldn't sit idly by anymore. I had to act. As I headed out the door to start my shift, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. The letter had changed something in me. It had opened my eyes to the truth that I had been avoiding. And now I was ready to face it. David's words echoed in my mind as I walked toward the gates of the facility. I want to do more than just survive. I want to live. Those words were my own now too, and I was ready to fight for that life. I wasn't sure how, or when, or where it would lead. But I knew I couldn't turn back now. The letter had opened a door that I couldn't close, and I wasn't going to try. Chapter 8: Confrontation. The days following the arrival of David's letter felt like a whirlwind. I had spent so much time reading and rereading his words that they had become a mantra in my mind, a constant reminder of everything I wanted to change in my life. But it wasn't just the letter that was on my mind. It was the growing feeling inside me that I couldn't ignore anymore. The weight of the truth, of what was happening in the asylum center, was becoming unbearable. And the deeper I got into this tangled web, the harder it was to pretend like everything was fine, like I wasn't part of a system that was failing the people I was meant to protect. Every shift at the center felt like a battle between what I knew was right and what I was supposed to do. I couldn't pretend to be just a guard anymore. I couldn't stand by and watch as people waited for answers that might never come. I had to do something, anything to help them. But I was still trapped in my own life, my life with Liam, my life of comfort and predictability. And every time I tried to break free, I was pulled back in. It was during one of those long, tense shifts that I saw him again. David. He was sitting alone at a table, his eyes distant, his face more serious than usual. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't care, that I wasn't moved by his story. I had to talk to him again. I had to know more. But just as I was about to approach him, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Mark, one of the other guards. His grip was firm, his expression unreadable. "Sophie," he said, his voice low. "You're not supposed to be talking to them like this. You know the rules." I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew what he meant. I knew the rules. We weren't supposed to engage with the asylum seekers beyond the most basic communication. We were supposed to be impartial, distant, observers. But that was the problem, wasn't it? I couldn't just observe anymore. I couldn't just sit by and watch as people suffered, as they waited for answers that might never come. "I'm just talking," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just trying to understand." "You don't understand," Mark replied, his tone hardening. "You think you can change things by talking to them? You think you can make their lives better by listening? They're not our problem. They're just part of the system. Our job is to keep them in line, to follow the rules. And you're crossing a line by getting too involved." His words hit me harder than I expected. He was right about one thing. I was crossing a line. But I wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. I couldn't just keep pretending that the rules were all that mattered. There were people here, real people, with real stories, real pain. And I couldn't ignore them anymore. I wasn't going to let the system dictate how I treated them. "I'm not just following the rules anymore, Mark," I said, my voice shaking slightly, but with a firmness I hadn't felt before. "I'm not going to pretend that everything is fine. These people need help. They need someone to listen to them, and I'm not going to stop just because it's against the rules." Mark's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he might say something else. But then he simply let go of my arm, stepping back with a frustrated sigh. "You'll regret this, Sophie," he said quietly. "The rules are there for a reason, and when you break them, there are consequences." I didn't say anything in response. I didn't need to. I knew he was right in his own way. There would be consequences. But I also knew that I couldn't keep going like this. I couldn't keep living a lie, pretending to be someone I wasn't. I had already made my decision. I was going to keep talking to the asylum seekers. I was going to listen to their stories, even if it cost me my job. Because I knew I had to. For them. For myself. As I turned back toward David, my heart was racing, the adrenaline from the confrontation with Mark still surging through me. I walked over to his table, my steps hesitant at first, but growing more confident as I got closer. David looked up when he saw me approach. His expression didn't change at first, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. A quiet understanding. It was like he knew what was happening, knew what I was about to say, before I even said it. "David," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I need to talk to you." He nodded, his face unreadable. He didn't speak, but he made a small motion with his hand, inviting me to sit down. I took the seat across from him, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. There was no turning back now. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, my voice shaking slightly. "About wanting to live, not just survive. And I've realized something. I've been surviving too, in my own way. I've been going through the motions, doing what I'm told, following the rules, but I'm not really living. I'm not really doing anything to help, to make a difference. And I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. David's eyes softened, and for the first time, I saw a real smile play at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a big smile, but it was genuine, warm. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "You don't have to keep pretending," he said. "You're not like the rest of them. You have the power to make a difference. You just have to stop being afraid of what might happen when you do." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. His words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the darkness I had been drowning in. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do yet, or how I was going to change things, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep going down this path of silence. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "I'm ready to fight," I said, my voice steady now. "I'm ready to do what it takes to help you and everyone else here. I don't know what the next step is, but I'm not going to be afraid anymore." David looked at me for a long moment, his gaze filled with something I hadn't seen before: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, things could change. For him. For all of them. "You don't have to do it alone," he said quietly. "We're in this together." And in that moment, I knew. I wasn't alone anymore. We weren't alone. The fight for justice, for freedom, for dignity. It wasn't just David's fight anymore. It was mine too. And I was ready to face whatever came next. No matter the cost, but as I stood up and walked away, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. There was still so much at stake. Mark's warning echoed in my mind. There are consequences. And I knew deep down that the consequences were coming. But for the first time, I was ready to face them. No matter what it cost me, I would never go back. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. Chapter 9. Walking Away. The days following my conversation with David felt like a whirlwind, the world around me spinning faster and faster with every decision I made. It was as if I had stepped into a new reality, one where everything I thought, I knew about myself, about my life, about what was important, had been turned upside down. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was no going back. I couldn't stay in this life I had built, this life that had once seemed so perfect. I had been lying to myself for so long, pretending that I was happy, that everything was fine. I had convinced myself that Liam and I were in love, that everything we had was enough. But as the days wore on, I couldn't deny it any longer. I was suffocating. I wasn't in love with Liam anymore. I wasn't even sure I knew who I was anymore. I had felt it for months. The distance between Liam and me, the growing chasm that we had been pretending didn't exist. But now, after everything that had happened, after hearing David's story, after seeing how much I had been blind to, I knew that I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep living a life that wasn't mine. I couldn't keep living a life that had been built on comfort and security at the expense of my own happiness. I had to walk away. But walking away wasn't going to be easy. I had spent so long with Liam, so long in this house, in this life, that the thought of leaving it all behind was terrifying. The house, the things, the life we had built together, none of it was mine anymore. It had been his. He had created it. He had controlled it. And I had let him. But now it was time to take control of my own life. I spent the next few days in a fog, unable to concentrate on anything. I tried to go through the motions, work, dinner, conversations with Liam, but it all felt like it was happening to someone else. I didn't belong there anymore. I didn't belong with him. And then, one evening, after another silent dinner where Liam barely spoke, I knew it was time. I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't keep dragging my feet, hoping that things would magically change. I had to make the decision, and I had to make it now. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Liam looked up, surprised, his brow furrowed. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with annoyance. "Where are you going?" "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady, but my heart was racing. I had never said the words aloud before, and hearing them made everything feel more real. I could feel the weight of the moment, the finality of it, but I knew I had made the right choice. Liam stared at me for a moment, his mouth open in disbelief. He didn't move, didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like I had said something impossible, something he couldn't quite process. "Leave? What do you mean, leave?" His voice was quieter now, a little more desperate. "Where are you going? Why? We can work this out. You don't have to do this." I shook my head, my chest tight. "I can't stay here anymore. This isn't working. Liam, it hasn't been for a long time. I'm not the same person I was when we met, and I'm not happy anymore. I'm not in love with you anymore. I'm sorry, but I can't do this." His face shifted from disbelief to anger. His eyes narrowed, his fists clenched. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the way his pride was wounded, but I couldn't back down. I had already made up my mind. I wasn't going to apologize for finally doing what I needed to do. I wasn't going to keep staying in a life that wasn't mine just to spare his feelings. "Are you serious?" he snapped, his voice rising now. "You're just going to leave? After everything I've done for you? You think you can just walk away from all of this?" He gestured around the room, his face twisted in frustration. "You think you can just throw everything away? This house, everything we've built together?" "I'm not throwing anything away, Liam," I said, my voice calm, but with a strength I hadn't known I had. "I'm choosing to live my life, to make my own choices, and I'm not going to do it in a life that's been dictated by you. I've lost myself here, and I can't keep doing this." Liam stood up abruptly, his chair falling to the floor behind him. He took a few steps toward me, his face now inches from mine. I could feel the heat of his anger, the tension radiating off him, but I didn't flinch. This was it, the moment that had been coming for months. You think you're better than me? He growled. You think you can just walk away from everything we have? From me? You think you can do better than this? I took a deep breath. My eyes locked with his. I'm not better than you, Liam, but I deserve better than this, and so do you. I could see the hurt in his eyes now, the raw vulnerability that he had been hiding beneath the anger. He took a step back, his fists unclenching, but his eyes still burning with emotion. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low, the words heavy with regret. You'll come back. You always do. You're not going to leave. You'll see. You're making a huge mistake. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. I'm not coming back, Liam. I can't. I have to leave. I have to figure out who I am, what I really want. And I can't do that with you. He stood there for a moment, silent, as though he was waiting for me to change my mind. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was done with the games, done with pretending, done with living a life that wasn't mine. Without another word, I turned and walked toward the door. I grabbed my bag, my coat, and without looking back, I walked out of the house. I felt a strange mix of fear and relief as I closed the door behind me, as if I were walking into an uncertain future, but one that was finally mine to control. The car was waiting outside, the engine running quietly. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I felt the weight of the past few years lift from my shoulders, just a little. I wasn't sure where I was going or what was going to happen next, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back to that life. Not now, not ever. And as I drove away, I knew that walking away was the hardest thing I had ever done. But it was also the only thing I could have done. It was the beginning of something new, something better. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally free. Chapter 10. A New Beginning. The morning after I left felt surreal. The world outside seemed to be moving in slow motion, as though everything had paused for me to catch up. I had left Liam. I had walked away from the life we built, and now I was standing at the precipice of something new. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with questions and fears, but it was mine to navigate. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew I couldn't go back to the life I had been living. It was time to embrace change, to step into a new chapter of my life. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I had no plans, no clear direction, but I knew I had to start somewhere. The first thing I did was head to Harriet's place. She had always been there for me, even when I didn't realize I needed someone. I hadn't told her about my decision yet, about leaving Liam, but I knew she would understand. She always understood. And right now, I needed to be with someone who knew me, who could remind me of who I was before all of this. When I arrived at her flat, the door swung open almost immediately. Harriet greeted me with a hug, her arms tight around me, her warmth a welcome contrast to the coldness that had been creeping inside me. You look like you've been through hell, she said, pulling back slightly to look at me, concern in her eyes. What happened? Where's Liam? I took a deep breath, fighting back the emotions that were threatening to spill over. I left him, I said, my voice shaky but resolute. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending. Harriet's face softened, and for a moment, she said nothing. She just hugged me again, tightly, as if she knew how much strength it had taken to make that decision. Finally, she pulled back, wiping a tear from her eye, though she tried to laugh it off. I knew it was coming, she said, her voice gentle. But I didn't know if you were going to go through with it. I'm so proud of you, Sophie. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. I didn't feel proud. I felt terrified, uncertain, and small. But I knew that walking away was the right thing. I knew that I had to do this for myself, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Harriet led me inside, and we sat down in her living room, the familiar surroundings comforting me. We spent the next few hours talking, catching up on everything I had missed in her life and everything I hadn't shared about mine. I told her about the asylum center, about the conversations I'd had with David, about how everything had shifted for me in a way I couldn't explain. David's story. It's made me realize something, I said, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. I've been living a lie. I've been living for Liam, for the comfort, for the things that didn't really matter. But David, his struggle, it opened my eyes. I can't keep pretending that I don't want more, that I don't want to fight for something that matters. I want to live for me. I want to do something that makes a difference. Harriet listened intently, nodding. You've always been strong, Sophie. You've always known what you wanted, even if you didn't realize it at the time. I think this is your chance to figure it out, to find out who you really are without all the distractions. Her words were like a lifeline, pulling me from the depths of uncertainty. I hadn't realized until now how much I had been hiding from myself. I had been so wrapped up in the life I thought I wanted, in the life Liam had created for us, that I had forgotten about my own dreams, my own desires. I had forgotten about the woman I used to be, the woman who wanted to be a writer, the woman who dreamed of making a difference in the world. Harriet and I spent the rest of the day talking about possibilities, about what the future could look like. She helped me find a small flat in the city, a place that felt like mine, a place where I could start over. It was small, but it was perfect. The walls felt fresh and full of potential, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. That evening, as I unpacked my things and made the small space my own, I thought about everything that had led me here. I thought about Liam, about the life we had shared, and about how hard it had been to walk away. But I knew it was the right decision. I knew that I couldn't keep living in the shadows of someone else's life. I had to step into my own light, and that meant letting go of the past. The next few weeks were a blur of new beginnings. I settled into my flat, adjusted to the quiet of living alone, and started to explore the city in a way I never had before. I spent my days at the library, reading and writing, rediscovering my passion for storytelling. I took long walks in the park, letting the fresh air fill my lungs and clear my mind. And at night, when the world was quiet, I would sit at my desk, and write, pouring my thoughts into the pages of a journal that had long been neglected. I had no idea where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. One day, I received another letter from David. The envelope was simple, but the words inside were anything but. He told me that he had been granted temporary asylum in the country and that he had moved to a small apartment in East London. He wrote about the small victories, the moments of hope, and how much he had appreciated our conversations. It was strange reading the letter. It felt like a connection, a bond that had been forged between us through our shared struggles. But it also felt like a reminder that my journey was just beginning. David had found his path, his chance for freedom. And now, it was my turn. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I was finally on the right path. I was no longer bound by the constraints of my past. I was free to be whoever I wanted to be, to live the life I had always dreamed of, and to fight for the things that mattered most to me. I had a voice, a story to tell, and I was going to make sure it was heard. And as I sat at my desk one evening, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the pages in front of me, I realized something. This was just the beginning. The rest of my life was still unwritten, and I was the one holding the pen. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. This was my new beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.